and we can move on to Ben's presentation.
But so what I want to talk to you all about today is basically I want to move on from Rhiannon, who did a great perspective looking backwards, thinking about sort of the deep, theories that go back, decades, and now talk about, stuff that is, in my opinion, really cutting edge. I'm going to present sort of findings that are incredibly fresh, and by incredibly fresh, I meant I was going through the qualitative data about 10 minutes ago to finalize this up, of work coming out of a project that myself, a lot of other people, Fubi, Dan, and others are working on, looking at how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting entrepreneurs across the UK. And what I want to do is give, again, some sort of really hot out of the oven insights into the effects that we're seeing on networks and the effects that we're seeing of the pandemic on how entrepreneurial ecosystems work. And this is really sort of a call, more of a beg for suggestions of, what should we be looking at? What are the interesting stories here? How can we link this with theory? And I have no clue how to get these images away of everyone, so I apologize if that blocks anything. But so I'll just start off talking a bit about networks. If you look at through all of entrepreneurship research, um, we find that most things are contingent, contextual, non-universal. There are very few universal truths in entrepreneurship. But it turns out one of those things are networks matter. There's been a bunch of meta-analysis. Sort of this image is coming from one of the most prominent ones, showing that almost regardless of the situation, regardless of the context, entrepreneurs with better networks, so more social capital, more diverse networks, sort of larger networks, are going to do better than their peers whose networks are smaller. And so this is, regardless of gender, geography, industry, high growth, sort of sustenance entrepreneurship, networks matter. And these networks matter because they are used to gather knowledge, gather resources, and create the connections necessary to create new value, to innovate, and to grow the business. And again, this has been profoundly influential on how we study entrepreneurship. We no longer see entrepreneurship as an individual phenomenon. To sort of go back to Schumpeter, who saw the entrepreneur as an economic Superman, now we are much more likely to see, it, in the words of Peter Nijenkamp, see the entrepreneur as a network hero, someone who is really good at activating their personal network. So we know networks matter. And then we know networks matter in entrepreneurial ecosystems because every single person who does one of these nifty social entrepreneurial ecosystem diagrams has networks as a box, a circle, a pyramid, whatever. These are seen as what makes entrepreneurial ecosystems work. The connections within a region between entrepreneurs, between other actors, is crucial for the flow of knowledge, resources, that enable sort of the scale up entrepreneurship, no matter what form, that we think is really, really important to economic development, to building social prosperity. And so again, sort of the irony of this in the internet age, and this in the age where we Zoom everything and can call anyone at any time, is that local networks matter. We are more likely to engage with people locally than we are online because, as we found out over this year, these conversations are awful on Zoom. It's really difficult. It does not have the nice back sort of flow of a in-person conversation, and you don't get any of the serendipity that you would, again, engaging in your local community, meeting someone, having a chance interaction, or even meeting for someone with a drink in an informal setting, walking through a hallway, seeing someone. These types of connections are incredibly important. And so this is something I've been arguing for a while without actually managing to write a paper on it, is that, one of the most important outcomes of this local networking, local connections, is that's enabling local coactive learning. So you talk to other people and you're not just absorbing knowledge from them, but the conversation creates new knowledge, new understandings around how to scale up an organization, how to grow. And that's what we want from entrepreneurial ecosystems. Networks allow the flow of knowledge, the flow of learning, the flow of resources, the flow of support, which is sort of doing all these nice things that we think matter, as many of us are economic development practitioners. So let's now sort of move this forward to sort of what do we know about crisis, networks, and entrepreneurial ecosystems? We know a lot about crisis, we know a lot about networks, and we know a lot about entrepreneurial ecosystems, but they haven't been really integrated yet. So we know that networks are important for recovering from a shock, for building resiliency, or for adapting to a really rapidly changing environment. So that's important on sort of the organizational entrepreneurial level. We also know that networks are important within entrepreneurial ecosystems to build a community recovery. So again, organizations don't possess all the resources, all the perspective, all the insight that they need in order to respond to a shock. And so they need to connect, they need to share, they need to engage each other in order to build collective regional responses. And in the super detailed diagram I have here from an earlier paper, we know that with entrepreneurial ecosystems, a shock can either be a good thing, it could release a lot of pent up potential, create new entrepreneurs, create new knowledge and ambition, or it can lead to bad things, and people can leave, and people can stop being entrepreneurs, and people can sort of run for cover. In which case, we lose a lot of those network connections. But frankly, we really don't know about a crisis of the scale of COVID. Most research on crisis is either about short, sudden shocks, so maybe a disaster, an earthquake, a hurricane, a riot, or they are longer term, but maybe what we generously call a bit less intense than what we're going through now. So the 2008 recession, very shocking, longer time, but much less intensive than what's going on right now. Or sort of again similar sort of local regional recessions that have less intensity. And so we don't know what's going on with a long yet intense shock. And so that's what I'm interested in finding out, and that's what our project team is interested in working about. And so this is what we call the ERIC project, which stands for Entrepreneurial Resiliency, Innovation, and Change during the COVID-19 crisis. So this is an ESRC UKRI funded project. On the PI. There's a whole a super team working on it, and I'll sort of name everyone at the end. But essentially, we're looking at every single thing that we could imagine. Interviews with high growth entrepreneurs across the UK, and we're doing this longitudinally. So we're doing follow up interviews about every 2 to 3 months. You can sort of see the numbers there. As of today, we've done 182 interviews. This is with 84 different firms, and so we've had follow-up interviews with 56 different firms, and for at least 12 firms, we've done 3, 4, 5 interviews. So we're getting a really unique perspective on crisis, because it's really rare to be able to conduct interviews during a crisis, and especially for one, and sort of see how that changes over time. What's amazing to me is that we promised the ESRC we do 60 interviews with 40 firms. People want to talk to us. People are not hiding the way they have in previous crises. So we're getting incredible perspectives on many, many different aspects of the crisis, of the recovery. And so one of the things I want to talk about now is what we're seeing in terms of how entrepreneurs are using networks and how this affects the ecosystem. So the first really interesting finding is that we're seeing a dynamic use of networks. So early in the pandemic, so March, April into May, people made very intensive use of their networks, of their pre-existing contacts with other entrepreneurs. In this first quote, it's a technology founder in London saying, we jumped on WhatsApp, we jumped on Slack, and we started sharing our communications to our employees. So explaining who's going to be furloughed, so we don't need to create everything from a blank slate. We saw this in many other ways. People turning to Slack groups. It could be an accelerator cohort, could be friends that they've met, people they've been in meetups before, sharing advice. But as all of you, I'm sure, share the same experience, it gets really frustrating to do this for a long time, to sort of go on these, endless Zoom drinks, Zoom meetups, Zoom chats, again, where there's no agenda, it's just vague checking in with people. Those aren't very good, and we saw people stopping that, relatively quickly. And what we're seeing now is that people really aren't using their networks. As we're doing follow-up interviews, they're talking less and less about their connections with others. Some of them are, there's a few people who are staying very strong they had very strong pre-existing networks. But the vast majority of people we're speaking to have really stopped engaging as carefully in networks. They're no longer turning to people for advice, learning from the experiences of others to solve common problems. They're just going at it on their own, or talking to maybe one or two very trusted mentors. a more really interesting phenomenon, one that I think is going to be one of the most lingering effects on entrepreneurs, is frozen networks. And this was really sort of summed up to me by a fintech entrepreneur in London who said, I haven't met anyone new in a year, that his network has not grown in, since the beginning of this pandemic. And because networks are so important, this means that, going on after the pandemic, even after, recovery, we can all go out, networks will be smaller. They will be harder to build, and people will have been lost in this. They will have weakened over this time because people aren't keeping in contact. People, entrepreneurs who fail are maybe dropping out, and maybe we might lose the habits of engaging. And we definitely see this with, again, we can see this in our own experience, but we can see this with them. Is again, just the challenge of setting up a Zoom call, of making that connection, is much harder than, again, a serendipitous or propinquitous interaction with someone at an event, at a facility, anything. And so this is, again, an ongoing challenge we're going to see. Finally, thinking about the ecosystem. Again, this is stuff we're still looking at. I don't know if this is a real finding or just, a few stories that are jumping out to me. But we're certainly seeing entrepreneurs can use their pre-existing networks. But anyone who didn't have a strong network in March 2020, when this all began, is really left out in the cold. There's really no one they could turn to. You can't, even if you could maintain existing connections, it's incredibly difficult to make new connections. So younger entrepreneurs, first-time entrepreneurs, those who haven't engaged, they're in for a challenge. So I just want to present some stylized facts about entrepreneurial ecosystems during COVID. Again, sort of derived from the data, but again, needs more robustness, needs more sort of good inquiry. We see an initial intensive use of the ecosystem that is replaced by a more insular focus on the firm. And I think, if we were to sum it up in one phrase, is that the spatial affordances, so being able to run into someone, again, the ease of connecting with someone locally, is not being substituted by digital affordances. That even though we all have Zoom, it is not the same. And that, again, has implications for how entrepreneurs learn. Local networks are a useful tool and they are used, but they are difficult to maintain in a crisis. Again, when there's only so much energy that can be spent on external conversations, when internal ones are very important. We see that, again, sort of these pre-COVID networks are used, but if you didn't have these networks, you can't build new ones, so you can't find access to new resources. And so really, this is what we see, is that if we think about what we would predict for post-pandemic ecosystems, is that they're still going to matter, but their role is going to change. As there's sort of a rise of remote working, it may be more difficult to get a critical mass of entrepreneurs, of people in a city center, to get to these meetups, to sort of create the vibrant environment that we currently see as, critical and sort of characteristic of strong entrepreneurial ecosystems. We should expect to lose a lot of actors. Entrepreneurs who fail may leave, stop being entrepreneurs. Investors may have lost money, may not engage. As government programs get cut and budgets get cut, we may see sort of fewer economic development organizations who are able to work in ecosystems. But I think that also creates an opportunity to try to include people who were excluded. These were exclusionary. And again, as Rhiannon said, we have this perspective that is laser focused on white male tech entrepreneurs living generally downtown. This is an opportunity to figure out where are we missing, who are the people who are now engaging with it, and open it up for them. So again, this is a lot of stylized facts, a lot of sort of early indicators. What we want to go through in this analysis is, again, really look for connections between firm founder attributes and their use of networks. So find more robust connections between those. Really look at what they're using networks for. So really interrogate these interviews that we have. It's such a rich data set. Really figure out what have they been able to get from their networks. And again, has this changed over the course of the crisis? And then again, see if we could connect ecosystem embeddedness, the extent to which they were or are embedded in the ecosystem, with how they're going to do 2 or 3 years down the line. Who survives, who thrives, and who fails. So I will leave it there. I am really welcoming any questions or suggestions you have of what we should be looking for. Again, we've got an all-star team working on this project. Many of them who are in this room right now, may possibly hearing about this for the first time. So again, this is really thanks to them and their amazing ability to gather and analyze just a huge amount of data. So thank you very much.
That provides some very up to the minute data around the position with networks, I guess, across the UK. Seems to be a trade-off in a way, doesn't it, between you're saying that networks are very important in a way, but they seem to have gone down the list in terms of what businesses can do at this point in time. If they were that important, maybe wouldn't they shift resources from or find new techniques of networking in a way beyond the limitations and of say Zoom, etc.
So I mean, what we see is that entrepreneurs are putting in a hell of a lot of emotional work and sort of emotional labor in just managing their employees. So checking in with them, making sure they're okay, making sure they're not too isolated. And frankly, they seem to be out of emotional energy to do anything else. And I also, there are different tools, there's, if Zoom is bad for you, could do Gather, which is kind of like a Pokemon style, 8-bit style, community. We could walk around, talk to people. And maybe some people like that, but again, I think that we only have so much emotional energy in a day, and we know that Zoom conversations are more emotionally sort of taxing on the brain than actually seeing someone in reality. I know I'm terrified when I run into someone outside. I forgot how to just even do that. And I think they are just running into a limit. And even though they may think networks are important, they may sort of miss these conversations. They just don't have the capacity.
Okay. We've got some other questions. Perhaps we'll kick off with Jana.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for the very interesting talk. When I saw the slide on the networks being frozen, the first thing that popped up to my mind, being a scholar who's located in Colombia, and having heard all these talks that the virtual conferences are going to make it more inclusive for Global South scholars, I just was wondering whether you have any idea from the conversations you had, whether there's a specific thing about the entrepreneurs, why the networks don't grow, or whether we can really say this is not going to work virtually to grow networks.
So it's funny, this really brings me back to what I did originally in my PhD thesis with Harold Batholt, which was on trade fairs and conferences. And again, what we learned there in looking at both academic conferences, but then also industry conferences, was that the talks were the least important thing. That if we were all together in Cardiff today, this would be the least important part of your day, listening to me. The most important part of your day would be running into Rob, getting coffee, or Alexandra, on your way to get your coat to go out. Those are the interactions that build trust, that build connections. And so certainly the entrepreneurs we're talking to, this is a big thing, is just how sales channels are changing, how they can't go to conferences and trade fairs and make the connections. They could certainly give a talk at a virtual trade show like this, and that's good for getting leads, but it's less useful for, again, sort of building the trust where 2 years down the line you can call someone and get your email responded. And so I think that's the pro of this, is certainly that, again, this is much more equitable. We can access things, talks are going online, you can sort of hear the headliners. What we haven't figured out is, again, sort of how to get that really important social milieu and back chatter that, again, sort of constitutes the relationship building of these aspect of the conferences.
We'll take the next one from Katerina, please.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. So since my research interest is also very much on networks and could you kurz leiser sein? Sorry. And ecosystems, I really like that you kind of connect the two analytical levels. And I was wondering, so I have two questions. So the first one is, if you account for networks also maybe going to actors outside the ecosystem, because people, the entrepreneurs ask other people, they might not necessarily be also all embedded within the ecosystem. So since you want to link the networking and the ecosystem levels, might be interesting to learn something about to what extent they're actually embedded within the ecosystem. And the second question that came to my mind also is inspired by some research I'm doing in the moment. We're also interviewing entrepreneurs. And what we see is that some of them actually have access to more networks and do more networking. So I was wondering if you also might have some cases that kind of do not match the pattern, and if you have some ideas under what conditions we might see this deviant phenomenon.
Yeah, so I mean, I could definitely think of several examples of people who have really done a great job at expanding their network. So one, a social entrepreneur in Belfast who has built networks with potential customers in the US. And again, what people are saying, it is really fascinating, is that now customers will take video calls in a way they never would before. And one of the things everyone loves, and I think we could all agree, is not having to travel. So that has been one of the great sources of liberation. And what I'm doing here is sort of drawing a distinction between maybe direct customer linkages. So the ability to, pitch someone, pitch an investor, pitch a customer virtually, versus sort of the knowledge gathering networks that we see characteristic of entrepreneurial ecosystems. So entrepreneurs being able to talk to each other, learn from them, think through challenging scale-up problems, which for me is the most important resource in entrepreneurial ecosystems, is that sort of knowledge and know-how. And that's what I'm seeing in these data of being really constrained, is that while they can, it's easier to make a purposeful connection. If I say, now I need to talk with Katerina, instead of having, again, to sort of fly over to Europe and, have a face-to-face conversation, now, we can set up a Zoom call in a way that she wouldn't have allowed because she's very, she's very busy before. But again, sort of maybe the lower key, more informal connections, again, that's what we're seeing dry up, and that's the concern. And so again, that sort of answers the first question as well, is that it's certainly true that many of them have built these longer, the global pipelines, again, to go back to Harold Batholt. But the buzzing is much lower, and that buzzing was really important.
Next question from Andy.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much, Ben. That was a very interesting, particularly as I've got a kind of slightly related COVID project, the ESRC, where we're doing something similar, but with sole traders and the self-employed. And certainly some of your findings around resilience, we're picking up, but I mean, a lot of it is quite dire in a way, and people want to talk because actually they want to unburden their souls.
It is free therapy. A lot of them have said,
yeah.
This is free therapy.
I mean, but I was particularly interested in the focus on networks. I mean, from my experience with working with entrepreneurial networks, particularly from the point of view of entrepreneurial learning, is that it is the tacit knowledge aspect that's really critical. So, it's down to unknown unknowns. I didn't know until I happened to meet you and we had a chance to explore and find out, what we're interested in, that the answer to something that I didn't know I needed to know the answer to, if you basically. And the role of entrepreneurial learning networks in exploring and uncovering all of that tacit knowledge is really important. And I think it's really interesting what you've got to say about the fact that in the current crisis, that is probably what's really dried up most. And you can go only so far with actors in the in the ecosystem, like universities and others, business support agencies, trying to engineer that kind of or facilitate that kind of networking. But it really does depend to a certain extent on people being able to kind of find the time and appreciate the value in that. So I mean, where do we go from here, I suppose, is my question. How if we have got a problem of networks collapsing, how on earth do we get those rebuilt again, and what has to happen to try and recover from this problem?
Yeah, I'm talking with people at Innovate UK next week, and all I can tell them is the best thing about my job is I don't need to come up with solutions. I just need to come up with problems, because I don't think they're easy solutions. Again, I haven't seen sort of an online format that's effective. Again, sort of the biggest thing people tell us, and I think we could realize from our own lived experience, is that when you set up a conversation with someone online, like, to set up a Zoom call, that is 15 minutes minimum block on your calendar. And it comes with an agenda. You say, I want to talk with you about this. There is no catching up unless that is in a really strong pre-existing relationship. There is no way to replicate that. Oh, I'm just going to grab coffee with someone, have a 5-minute conversation, move on to someone else. You can you could try to replicate that with Zoom. You could, change breakout rooms every 10 minutes, but it won't work for any number of reasons. And so my thinking is, again, the way to deal with this is just once this is over, to recognize that this is a problem. and again, to prioritize hosting events, telling entrepreneurs this is important, that you do need to get out there, talk to people, make it as easy as possible. So again, moving away from city centers, if people are still remote working, try to set up possibly smaller things, in suburbs, in satellite areas. But again, I think this is again one of the things we're trying to do with talking about these issues, is really to just highlight the issue, say this is a problem. We need to start coming up with solutions, not necessarily for right now online, but post-pandemic or pandemic recovery, to really highlight this as an important thing we should be aware of.
Okay, Alexandra, please.
Hi, Ben. Thank you so much. I liked it a lot. We are leading a project in Germany called Recovery, and it deals with migrant entrepreneurs and their role in the ecosystems, and what happens if they are more resilient than, let's say, German entrepreneurs are. And what we found out is that local ecosystems or local networks become very, very important to them, while before COVID, they tried to go outside, and they got their resources from other places. Let's put it like that. And I just was wondering, it's not really a question, but maybe we should also take into consideration, what about the power relations and power sharing in the ecosystems? What will happen afterwards? There is something about these people I cannot tell you. I am working on the topic migrant entrepreneurship. I don't like the word migrant, but however, for 16 years now, and it's something about them. They know what to do when things like that happen, call it whatever it is, resilience, knowledge. I call it resilience knowledge, and the point is how to put all the resources together to build up afterwards. So that would be maybe another view, but I loved your presentation, and to be very honest, I will take it under consideration that you say that the local, I will put it the other way around, and we'll see. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for that. Please send me some stuff on that project. Again, I really like this idea of, again, seeing how people's use of networks changes. And so again, that's why you need this longitudinal perspective, because crisis is change. Like if you go back to the Greek, crisis is a moment of change. This is just an incredibly long moment, but seeing this change is really important. And you keyed on something that I think is ultra important that I never actually get around to writing about, and I beg everyone else to write about, which is power relations in ecosystems. Again, we view these things as egalitarian. They are not. Again, who has the power, who has access to resources, who is a gatekeeper? That may change post-pandemic. That may get reinforced during this pandemic. And that's, again, something really important to look into, because, again, these are exclusionatory. An ecosystem is exclusionatory. Maybe it's good exclusion. We keep out parasites. Sort of consultants who drain energy and bad actors. But oftentimes they're exclusionatory for people because of who they are, what they look like, where they've been. And that is going to slow down the recovery. And so that's why it's really important to critically examine, again, who has power and how they use that power.
Okay, we're just about out of time for this session, but we've had a few questions on the chat. I'll try to sort of summarize them together, Ben, I think, in terms of one final question. I think it's largely been asking about other actors within the ecosystem, particularly around financiers, venture capitalists, accelerators. And so the idea of how they've been, I guess, been able to access new ideas and new things to commercialize. And around that, there was a question around the Entrepreneurship Discovery process, which is similar in a way, and thinking more widely about others, things beyond, I guess, the shores of the UK in terms of smart specialization in Europe.
Yeah, so Christina really honed into like the biggest problem with our research. So thank you, Christina. Which is that we're only talking to entrepreneurs, and ecosystems are more than entrepreneurs. And if I could go back in time, maybe I would change that. But there's frankly so much to do that I'm not sure we could. But what is interesting, if you look at the data and even what we're seeing in our interviews, I think just talking to many people, is that investors were less hurt by the pandemic than everyone thought. Certainly March and April, almost every deal collapsed. So again, we see that pretty clearly in our data. but we're kind of actually seeing venture capitalists in particular becoming much more non-local. There's always been a very well-known geography to venture capital. And I honestly think that is changing. I haven't seen numbers on this yet, but from the interview data, people are being approached by global venture capitalists from America, from Europe. They're pitching online. There is none of this issue around, the venture capital not be able to inspect the thing or do their due diligence. So that may be one of the more interesting changes on the horizon, is sort of the changing of global venture capital networks, and maybe it becomes a bit less spiky and a bit more flat, like it was supposed to be all along. But in terms of other actors, such as, again, sort of community groups, meetups, I just don't know as well as I should. My experience is just sort of the Edinburgh gossip versus sort of a better, more robust knowledge. So that's definitely a hole in our research, and again, an opportunity for other researchers to come in and look at that really interesting question.
Michael, do you have a very quick one?
Yes, I have. Ben, I like your presentation a lot. I think, is it possible to look at the personality traits of the entrepreneurs as a moderating variable in how that networks use change? Because I think open people and extroverted people are much more likely to contain the networks than introverts and neurotic people.
So there's definitely some interesting stuff there, maybe not in networks, but in return to office. I definitely see two categories of our interviewees. One is technical people who are in heaven and are fine working at home and have no issues, and again are going to continue this. There's another core of, again, and it's almost entirely people coming from a managerial creative background, founders who are desperate to get everyone back into the office because they miss the frisson. And they miss the creativity that's caused by that. And again, they are on the verge of committing crimes in terms of how quickly they want their workers back in the office. And again, there's a lot there and a lot we're unpacking, but there's certainly personality characteristics. I'm a bit less confident assigning that to networks or to networking. Certainly, I could see some connections between those who have been continually engaged with their communities, again, doing all the online things, but our data just isn't good enough. Again, it's really hard to classify personalities based on sort of interviews where that wasn't the goal. But it's a really interesting thing.
There seems to be some emerging literature. I wouldn't say literature coming out from blogs, suggesting that Zoom networking and other forms of online platforms is changing things with regards to the role of more introvert individuals compared to extrovert individuals, and the way they can make a different contribution in terms of different fora, etc. So that might be a starting point. Right, we're overdue for a break. Thank you very much.